Part 1 had worked in the Galactic Bureau of Celebrations for 300 cycles. She had planned parties for beings made of pure energy. She had organized festivals for creatures who existed in multiple dimensions at once. She had even managed to create a successful gathering for the Silence Keepers, a species that communicated only through the absence of sound. None of that prepared her for the convergence of 10,000 realms. The convergence was the biggest event in the known universe. It happened once every million cycles, and it brought together representatives from every dimension, every reality, and every plane of existence. The last convergence had ended in disaster. 3 dimensions had gone to war. A black hole had formed in the refreshment area. Someone had insulted the Void Emperor's hat, and the resulting conflict had erased 2 star systems from existence. That was why the Bureau had given the job to. She was their best coordinator. She had 7 faces, each capable of independent thought, and she could process 14 different crisis situations at once. Her compound eyes could see into 3 spectrums simultaneously, which helped when dealing with beings who existed in different light frequencies. But as she stared at the guest list for the convergence, she felt something she had not felt in 200 cycles. Fear. The list was impossible. The crystalline delegates required absolute silence at all times. Any sound above a whisper would shatter their molecular structure. But the plasma beings needed constant noise to maintain their coherence. Without sound waves to stabilize them, they would simply dissipate into nothing. The void dwellers consumed light as food. They absorbed photons the way other beings breathed air, but the generated light involuntarily. They glowed with the brightness of small suns, and they could not stop even if they wanted to. Putting them in the same room would either starve the void dwellers or blind everyone else. The temporal diplomats experienced time in a non-linear fashion. To them, the end of the party had already happened, was happening now, and would happen soon, all at once. They found linear scheduling deeply offensive, but the rigid entities could only exist in strict sequential time. Any disruption to the normal flow of moments would cause them to phase out of reality entirely. Read through 3,000 more entries, and each one made the situation worse. Some beings ate what others were made of. Some beings spoke in frequencies that killed other beings. Some beings existed as concepts rather than physical forms, and they required belief to survive, but other beings were immune to abstract thinking and would accidentally unbelieve them out of existence. 14 coordinators had tried to plan this event before her. 12 had resigned. 2 had from stress. Their particles were still floating around the Bureau's main office, occasionally forming shapes that looked like screaming faces. Closed the guest list and sat in silence for a long moment. All 7 of her faces wore the same expression of deep concern. Then she did something forbidden. She accessed the restricted archives. The Bureau kept files on thousands of dimensions, but some were locked away. These were the dimensions considered too dangerous, too unstable, or too strange to be useful. Dimension 7842C was in that category. It had been quarantined for 6,000 cycles, marked as chaotically unpredictable and fundamentally irrational. The inhabitants called themselves humans. Had heard rumors about them. They were a young species, barely evolved. They fought wars over invisible concepts. They damaged their own planet while living on it. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization and then decided to keep them. By all reasonable standards, they should have wiped themselves out long ago. But they hadn't, and as read through the files, she began to understand why they had survived. Humans were impossible. They held events called weddings where families who hated each other gathered in the same building and somehow managed not to kill anyone. They organized festivals where hundreds of thousands of individuals with different beliefs, different backgrounds, and different ideas about acceptable behavior came together in heat and mud and chaos, and called it the best experience of their lives. They had something called a family reunion, where people who disagreed about everything from politics to the proper way to cook meat somehow coexisted for entire days. They had office parties where beings who spent all year competing against each other suddenly pretended to be friends. They had funerals where people told jokes and celebrations where people cried. Nothing about their social gatherings made logical sense, and yet they worked. Found records of something called a circus. In a circus, humans brought together fire breathers, wild animals, acrobatic performers, small children, and elderly relatives. They put all of these in the same space, often in a structure made of flammable fabric, and called it entertainment. By every calculation, a circus should result in mass casualties. Instead, humans had run them successfully for hundreds of cycles. She found records of music festivals where the sound levels would have killed crystalline delegates instantly, but humans stood in the noise for days and considered it a spiritual experience. She found records of conventions where tens of thousands of strangers gathered in enclosed spaces to celebrate shared interests, and they had developed systems to make this work. Name tags to prevent the social disaster of forgotten identities. Schedules printed on paper. Designated areas for different activities. The humans had invented something they called a quiet room. This was a space at loud events where overwhelmed attendees could go to recover. It was such a simple idea that felt embarrassed that no one in the Bureau had ever thought of it. They had created seating charts. These were strategic arrangements designed to prevent conflict between incompatible individuals. Humans apparently had something called in-laws, which were family members acquired through mating partnerships. These in-laws often despised each other, but through careful seating arrangements, humans managed to keep them from open warfare during meals. They had dietary accommodation protocols. Found this particularly fascinating. Humans came in countless varieties. Some could not eat certain foods for religious reasons. Some could not eat certain foods for medical reasons. Some simply chose not to eat certain foods for philosophical reasons. A human event planner would routinely manage meals for dozens of different dietary requirements simultaneously. They would feed beings who ate only plants alongside beings who ate only meat, and no one would die. Most remarkably, humans had figured out how to make all of this feel natural. Their events did not seem like complex logistical operations. They seemed like fun. The attendees did not realize how much work went into keeping them alive and happy. They simply enjoyed themselves. Spent 14 hours reading human event planning documents. She studied wedding coordination guides. She analyzed music festival logistics reports. She examined something called a trade show floor plan and felt her third face weep with admiration at its elegant efficiency. When she finished, she knew what she had to do. The Bureau's council chamber was a vast space designed to accommodate beings of all sizes and compositions. Director sat at the central platform, his 17 tentacles arranged in a pattern that indicated formal attention. The other council members floated, stood, hovered, or existed conceptually around him. Presented her findings. She showed them the human files. She explained the wedding protocols and the festival logistics. She demonstrated the seating chart technology and the dietary accommodation systems. The council reacted with horror. Director's tentacles curled with disgust. The beings around him flickered with disbelief. Several of them made sounds that indicated they thought had finally cracked under the pressure. Humans were primitives. They were barely sentient. They still fought over resources instead of sharing them. They had not even achieved basic dimensional travel. The idea of using their techniques was absurd. But stood firm. She presented the evidence. She showed them that humans had been successfully managing impossible social situations for thousands of their short cycles. She demonstrated that their methods worked even when logic said they should not. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Director looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke the words that would change event planning forever. "Bring me one of these humans." Part 2 was having a bad week even before the aliens arrived. The music festival he had spent 8 months planning had been hit by a freak storm. The main stage had flooded. 3 headlining acts had canceled at the last minute. Someone had released 1,000 butterflies in the VIP area, and no one would admit to doing it. The catering company had delivered 400 vegetarian meals to the meat-eater's tent and 400 steaks to the vegan section. He had fixed all of it. He had built a new stage in 6 hours. He had convinced a retired rock legend to come out of retirement for one night. He had personally caught 200 butterflies with a net while giving instructions to his team through a headset. He had swapped the meals so fast that only 12 people had noticed the mistake. That was what did. He solved impossible problems and made it look easy. He had organized 3 Olympic opening ceremonies, 2 royal weddings, and more corporate events than he could count. He had once planned a surprise birthday party for a head of state while simultaneously managing a charity concert on another continent. He had done both successfully, and he had slept 4 hours total that week. But nothing in his 30 years of event planning had prepared him for waking up on a space station between dimensions. The room he found himself in was wrong in ways he could not fully describe. The walls seemed to exist at angles that should not have been possible. The light came from everywhere and nowhere. When he tried to focus on any single point, his eyes slid away as if the space itself refused to be seen clearly. Standing in front of him was a being with 7 faces. Had worked with difficult clients before. He had managed the expectations of billionaires, dictators, and pop stars, all of whom believed the universe revolved around their specific needs. He had once spent 3 hours explaining to a tech executive why the laws of physics prevented the indoor fireworks display from happening near the open bar. He drew on that experience now. "Okay," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm going to need some information. Where am I, who are you, and is there coffee?" The 7-faced being introduced herself as. She explained the situation in terms that almost understood. There was a big party coming up. The guests were from different dimensions. They had conflicting needs. Everyone who had tried to plan this party before had failed or died. Died asked. Said, their physical forms dissolved from stress. Right, had worked with assistants who claimed they would die if they had to make one more seating chart. He understood the sentiment, even if these aliens took it literally. And you want me to plan this party instead? We want you to teach us how humans plan events. Looked around the impossible room. He thought about his life back on Earth, where his biggest problem was butterfly removal and meal logistics. He thought about his apartment, his cat, and the stack of unread emails waiting for him. Then he thought about the challenge, the biggest event in the universe, guests from 10,000 different realities, problems that no human had ever faced. He smiled. "Show me the guest list." The guest list was worse than anything had ever seen. It made his royal wedding seating charts look like children's puzzles. It made his Olympic logistics spreadsheets look like grocery lists. But as he read through it, patterns began to emerge. The problems were complicated, but they were not actually new. He had dealt with guests who could not be in the same room. He had managed dietary requirements that seemed mutually exclusive. He had created schedules for events where everyone wanted to be first and no one wanted to wait. The scale was different. The specifics were strange. But the core challenges were the same ones he faced every time he planned a gathering of diverse beings with conflicting needs. "Okay," he said after 3 hours of reading. "I see what's happening here. You're trying to create one event that works for everyone. That's your first mistake." 7 faces all looked confused. The convergence is one event. It must be one event. It has always been one event. Sure, it's one event, but one event can have multiple experiences happening simultaneously. Pulled up a blank space on whatever passed for a screen in this dimension. You've got beings who need silence and beings who need noise. You can't change that, but you can separate them. He started drawing. The lines appeared in the air in front of him, glowing with soft light. He created a rough map of the event space. Sound travels, but it can be contained. You create zones. The crystalline delegates get an area with sound dampening. Not just walls, but actual sound absorption. Nothing gets in. They can see everything happening through screens, but they experience it in silence. He drew another section. The plasma beings get a sound garden, a space where they can generate all the noise they want. You position it here at this dimensional angle so the sound waves don't intersect with the quiet zones. Studied the drawing. We tried separation before. The delegates complained that they were being excluded. That's because you made it feel like exclusion. You have to make it feel like a VIP experience. Had learned this lesson early in his career. Nobody wanted to be left out, but everyone wanted to feel special. You don't tell them they can't be with the other guests. You tell them they've been given an exclusive space designed specifically for their needs. Private viewing, personal service, the best experience possible. That is the same thing with different words. Welcome to event planning. Moved on to the light problem. The void dwellers and they were trickier. He could not simply put walls between them because the void dwellers consumed light from any distance. What if there were something, he asked, some kind of containment that held their light in? They would die. Their light must radiate outward or it builds up and destroys them. Okay, so containment is out. Thought about it. Can you redirect the light, send it somewhere else? Considered this. We could open a dimensional pocket. The light would flow into it instead of into the surrounding space. Perfect. They get to glow as much as they want, and the light goes into a pocket instead of feeding the void dwellers. You could even put something useful in the pocket. Storage space for equipment. A backup venue in case something goes wrong. This was how humans thought, realized. They did not try to change the nature of things. They worked around it. They built structures and systems that let incompatible elements coexist by keeping them separate while maintaining the illusion of togetherness. Spent the next 2 days rebuilding the entire event from the ground up. He created a scheduling system that divided the convergence into phases. Different groups would have different prime hours. The temporal diplomats would experience the whole thing non-linearly anyway, so he designated them as floating attendees who could access any phase at any time. The rigid entities would follow a strict schedule, clearly posted and never altered. He invented new solutions for problems that had stumped 14 professional coordinators. The beings who ate what other beings were made of would be served synthetic alternatives that tasted identical but came from non-sentient sources. The beings who spoke in deadly frequencies would be given translation devices that converted their speech into safe sounds. The beings who existed as concepts would be placed in areas with high belief attendees who would naturally maintain their existence without even trying. What about the refreshments? Asked. We have 3,000 different dietary requirements. Stations, said immediately. Not a sit-down meal. You create food stations throughout the venue. Each station serves specific types. Guests go to the stations that work for them. They never have to see food that offends them, and they never have to wait for someone else's meal. That seems inefficient. It's incredibly efficient. Trust me, I've done this for 50,000 people at once. Stations are always faster than plated service. Watched him work and felt something strange. Hope. For the first time since she had received this assignment, she believed the convergence might actually succeed. Part 3. The convergence of 10,000 realms began on schedule, which was already a victory. Stood in the central coordination hub, watching feeds from across the venue. The space was enormous, stretching across 17-dimensional layers. Each layer had been customized according to his specifications, and each one was functioning exactly as planned. The crystalline delegates had arrived first. They entered their silent zone through a special corridor lined with sound-absorbing materials. Inside, They found comfortable arrangements, perfect climate control, and screens showing everything happening in the main halls. Several of them sent messages expressing appreciation for the accommodations. One even used the phrase, "finally, someone who understands," which said was the highest compliment a crystalline could give. The plasma beings arrived next, crackling with energy. They flowed into the sound garden and immediately began generating noise. The garden was designed to convert their emissions into music, which played throughout the zone in constantly shifting patterns. Several plasma beings stayed in the garden for hours, creating what they later described as the most beautiful compositions of their existence. The light situation worked perfectly. They glowed freely in their designated area, their light streaming into a dimensional pocket that had been converted into additional storage space. The void dwellers circled the edges of the dark zones, feeding on carefully calibrated artificial light that satisfied their hunger without endangering anyone. But knew that the real test would come when something went wrong. Something always went wrong. The first crisis arrived 4 hours into the event. A delegation of temporal diplomats had gotten into an argument with the rigid entities. The temporals experienced the disagreement in non-linear fashion, which meant they were simultaneously angry about something that had not happened yet while trying to apologize for an offense they had not committed. The rigids could not process this and were threatening to phase out of reality entirely. Arrived at the scene with floating beside him, he assessed the situation in seconds. "Okay," he said, stepping between the two groups. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding. Let me explain what's happening here." He turned to the temporal diplomats. "From your perspective, this argument has already been resolved. You know how it ends. But these beings experience time differently. For them, the resolution hasn't happened yet, and they need to go through the process to reach it." The temporals shifted in ways that suggested confusion. "But we already apologized." "You will apologize. From their perspective, you haven't yet. I know it feels redundant to you, but could you do them the courtesy of experiencing the apology in there?" This was a technique had used before, though never in exactly this context. At events, people often arrived with preconceptions about how things would go. Sometimes they had already decided to be angry or offended. The trick was to redirect their expectations without dismissing their feelings. The temporal diplomats agreed to apologize again in linear sequence. The rigid entities accepted. Crisis resolved. The second problem was bigger. A being called the Abstract Hunger had arrived uninvited. It existed as pure appetite, consuming concepts rather than physical matter. It had already eaten the idea of comfortable seating in one section of the venue, causing every chair in that area to become slightly wrong in ways no one could describe. "How do you fight something that eats ideas?" asked. "Thought about it. You don't fight it, you redirect it. What concepts could we afford to lose?" They identified several targets. There was a storage area filled with broken equipment from previous events. The equipment held concepts like malfunction and disappointment and waste. They lured the Abstract Hunger there with a trail of minor negative concepts, and it spent the rest of the convergence happily consuming feelings of failure and frustration. The venue actually improved. With the Abstract Hunger eating negative concepts, the overall mood lifted. Attendees reported feeling unusually optimistic. Several delegates who had arrived planning to cause trouble found themselves unable to remember why they had been upset. "That's incredible," said. "You turned a disaster into an improvement." "Event planning is just problem solving with a deadline," replied. "The problems never stop. You just get better at solving them." The third crisis came near the end of the first day. The catering stations had run low on certain supplies, and 3 different groups were claiming they had been promised exclusive access to the same refreshment area. A fight was about to break out. Did not even need to think about this one. He had handled catering disputes so many times that his responses were automatic. He apologized sincerely to all 3 groups. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made. He did not blame anyone specifically. Then he offered each group something better than what they had originally wanted. One group got first access to a premium station that had just opened. Another group received personal service from a dedicated catering unit. The third group was invited to a private tasting of rare delicacies from dimensions that most beings never got to experience. All three groups left happy. None of them realized they had been managed. "How do you do that?" asked. "How do you make angry beings feel satisfied without giving them what they originally demanded?" "People don't always want what they say they want," explained. "Usually, they want to feel respected and valued. If you can give them that feeling, the specific details become flexible." The convergence continued for 3 days in local time, though the temporal diplomats would later describe it as lasting anywhere from an instant to an eternity, depending on their mood. There were more problems. There were always more problems. A dimensional rift opened in the entertainment zone. A delegation of energy beings accidentally merged with the lighting system. Someone tried to assassinate the Void Emperor and had to improvise a security response while simultaneously ensuring that the dessert service continued uninterrupted. He handled all of it. On the final day, something remarkable happened. The representatives from 10,000 realms gathered in the central hall for the closing ceremony. This was traditionally the most dangerous moment, when all the tensions that had been building throughout the event could explode into conflict. Instead, there was peace. The crystalline delegates had formed friendships with beings they had never been able to communicate with before. The screens in their silent zone had allowed them to observe and respond to conversations in ways that would have been impossible in person. They had developed new diplomatic relationships with 7 different dimensions. The plasma beings had discovered that their sound compositions could be translated into visual art that they found beautiful. A collaboration had begun. The two groups were planning joint exhibitions in their home dimensions. The Void Dwellers had learned about the dimensional pocket technology that redirected this light. They were working with Bureau scientists to develop new feeding methods that would not require them to consume natural light sources. For the first time in their history, they could imagine a future where they did not have to darken every space they entered. Director approached as the closing ceremony concluded. His 17 tentacles were arranged in a pattern that had never seen before. She thought it might indicate something like admiration or possibly disbelief. "In 3 million cycles," the director said, "no convergence has ended without at least one dimensional incident. Wars have started here. Civilizations have fallen. We once lost an entire reality because someone served the wrong appetizer." He paused. "This convergence has had no incidents, no wars, no erased civilizations, no significant conflicts at all." "The night is young," said. "In event planning, you never celebrate until everyone's gone home. Our delegates are already leaving. They are expressing satisfaction. Several have asked if you will plan the next convergence." "The next one is in 1,000,000 cycles, right? I might be busy." Director did not seem to understand the joke. "We would like you to remain with the Bureau. Your techniques have value beyond this single event. We could apply them to gatherings throughout the known dimensions." Thought about it. He looked at who had worked beside him for 3 days without rest. He looked at the impossible venue, the strange beings, the challenges that no human had ever faced. He thought about his life back on Earth, the festivals and weddings and corporate events, the problems that seemed so big at the time but were really so small compared to this. "I'll need some conditions," he said. "Name them." "Coffee, real coffee from Earth. I don't care what dimensional equivalent you think you have. I need the real thing." He held up a finger. "And I need to be able to go home sometimes, visit my planet, see my cat." "These terms are acceptable." "And I want creative control. I'll listen to advice, but final decisions are mine. No committee overrides. No last-minute changes from delegates who think they know better. Director's tentacles shifted. That is unusual. Our events are typically planned by consensus. Your events typically end in disaster. There's a connection there. A long moment passed. Then Director made a gesture that apparently indicated agreement. Welcome to the Galactic Bureau of Celebrations. The word spread across 10,000 dimensions. The humans had solved the impossible problem. Their event planning techniques were not primitive at all. They were sophisticated beyond anything the advanced civilizations had developed. Humans had learned to manage chaos because they lived in chaos. They had developed conflict resolution because they fought constantly. They had created hospitality protocols because they were a species that needed to be taught how to get along, and that teaching had produced systems more effective than anything that beings of pure logic could design. Within one cycle, human event planning methods were being adopted throughout the known dimensions. Seating charts became standard. Dietary accommodation protocols spread from reality to reality. The concept of the quiet room was hailed as revolutionary. Back on Earth, people continued throwing parties and planning weddings and organizing festivals. They had no idea that their techniques had changed the universe. They just kept solving problems, one event at a time, making things work through stubbornness and creativity and an endless supply of spreadsheets. Became the most famous event planner in history, but he never forgot where he came from, and every convergence he organized, he included one small tradition from Earth. Name tags. Because even in a gathering of 10,000 realms, everyone deserved to have their name remembered.